Hello, I'm Dan Elliott. Right beside me here, I've got a 3910 Ford tractor. I went on YouTube and I wanted to find out, I've got a little bit of a leak in a power steering pump. I wanted to see what I needed to do and what I needed to, tools and so forth. Couldn't find what I was looking for, so kind of wanted to show you a little bit as we do this one. But this is a Ford 3910, and I think it's somewhere along about an 87 model, and we can find the numbers on this particular model. There's a little, it's not a data plate, it's really a little sticker under the hood. It's got the numbers on it when you go to buy parts for yours. This particular tractor has them under the hood, as well as right here on the transmission housing and the rear end housing here on top. And those are places also too, but you can go to internet and should tell you to where you find your numbers. Also too, on this particular tractor, I've got a safety switch. This tractor stays parked a lot, so I've got a switch that cuts the battery off to where I have no power, cuts the circuit between the battery and the starter, so I have no power on the tractor, and I've turned the power off as I always do when I keep it parked. Now we're going to go to the power steering pump, take a look at it. All right, this is the left-hand side of our 3910 Ford tractor. This is our power steering pump. I have pressure washed this off to make it a whole lot easier to kind of isolate the problem. I've got a little bit of a leak, and from what I can find out from technicians is it's either in this fitting that attaches up to the bottom of the pump because it has an O-ring under this little nut right here, or it could be the O-ring that's around the outside of this reservoir. And I have cleaned it, and I think I've isolated the problem to the front up here where it may have a leak, a bad O-ring. This tractor is about 32 or 33 years old. So we're going to replace this O-ring and see if that doesn't fix our problem, because that's the cheapest of the things to do. I went to the auto parts store, gave them the numbers that I had, and got a filter kit, because inside this reservoir, and you can see down in the opening, you can see this filter that's sitting right inside the housing right there, and this is the pump reservoir for our fluid for our power steering. So this filter is inside this housing, and in the kit also comes a large O-ring that seals the reservoir, and then a smaller washer that seals our pressure line at the rear of the reservoir. So hopefully we've got the parts that we need, but this kit was about $10, and if it does indeed be that our power steering pump is bad, the best I can find price-wise on the internet is somewhere around $250. And I don't want to have to replace it unless I have to, but to do that, there's 3 bolts at the front of the housing up here. Take those 3 bolts out, take the lines loose, and the pump should come off. But we're not going to worry about that today, because we're only concerned about our O-ring at the rear and then our larger O-ring around the reservoir. And we will get started. I've already cracked the lines loose here. This is the pressure line. At the bottom, this is the line returns to the reservoir at the top. And our line at the bottom, whenever you can, be sure and use a line wrench. It allows you to get full contact, because if you round any of these fittings off, it's extremely hard to make these lines and fittings and make them to where they don't leak. But we've already cracked these loose. We used a line wrench, and I'm also going to pull this oil filter off. I don't know if I need to, but I'm going to go ahead and get it out of the way, that way that we can work. We've also got a little cover where the lines come along the engine block and the transmission housing. They have brackets that separate the lines, and it's important to leave those brackets on there, and if they don't have them, you need to get them, because the lines over time will rub together and rub a hole in them. So you want to make sure that they're separated, and the only other bracket that mounts this is one bracket here at the transmission housing. Then we're going to take this cover off and expose our lines at the sector. And I'm going to go ahead, this panel has a Phillips head fitting, Phillips head screw And you want to make sure that when you do this, you have a really good screwdriver. I've got a number 3 tip screwdriver. Doesn't matter what brand it is, as long as it's a good one. And then also too, it's got a means of using a wrench on it where you can use full pressure holding in, pushing in on the screwdriver as you loosen this Phillips head screw. It's important to do that because you don't want to round these off, and if your tractor's like mine and it has satellite, you don't know what condition the threads are in, whether it's rusted in or it comes out easy. But I've loosened mine. They seem to come loose fairly easy, but like I say, just be careful, as well as your wrenches on your fittings, to make sure. These tractors have a lot of metric bolts on them, but I found that the lines on this thing were American. That's the wrench that fitted the best, was a 11/16 on the pressure, and you can use a 19 millimeter or 3/4 on the return, but I found that these seem to be American on the lines. American wrenches fit it the best. Just use the wrench that fits it the best. Be careful and don't round off these nuts that holds these lines on, because if you do, these are extremely hard to replace, and these lines are rather expensive. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this cover on off and expose our lines at the sector, and we'll get ready to take these lines loose. All right, the wrench that fit these fittings the best was an 11/16. And you also see under this line fitting, there is a fitting that screws into the steering sector. It also is an 11/16. And you want to make sure when you pull these things off, you want to hold that fitting to make sure you don't break that fitting loose, because if you do, you could twist the line into right here behind this fitting nut, and you definitely don't want to do that. So you want to hold that fitting, get it broken loose, and make sure that your line is free of your fitting, that this fitting nut will turn and it's not twisting the line whenever you start doing that. If you know that it's free and clear, then you can spin that on off. We can take our lines off, but if that's frozen up or if it's rusted, you can put a little bit of heat to it. The heat might break it loose, and it might be a deal to where that it may be rusted too much and you may have to get new lines for your tractor. But I've got these lines taken loose at the sector. We've got our one bracket that mounts to our transmission housing, and that is a 19 millimeter or a 3/4 bolt. And we're going to take that bracket loose. We'll lay our bolt right there. The lines are loose at our pump up here. I've got them loose. And you notice at the bottom of the pump, there's a brace fitting. And whenever you take a line loose and you've got a brace fitting, you want to be able to go behind it and support it to make sure that when you break the line loose, you don't break that fitting off the pump. Very easy to do if the line's extremely tight. So you want to support that fitting while you loosen the nut. So we'll go ahead and get these lines off and get them out of the way. All right, this is our line assembly. And whatever you do, just like our oil filter, we removed our oil filter. We've got it over here covered up. It was a clean filter, so we don't want anything to contaminate it. And also too, behind this power steering is our wire that is our gauge or our light on the dash. Sorry about that, but it is for our light for our oil pressure. So you want to make sure I've disconnected it, and I'm going to pull it up a little bit out of the way, but you want to make sure when you get done that that's hooked up, and you want to make sure when you turn the switch on, you do have a light on before you start it, and after you start it, the light goes out. So we'll make sure we do that whenever we get done. But now we're going to take this reservoir housing off, and there's one 13 millimeter bolt that goes through the back that holds this housing on, and we're going to spin it off. This also holds our return fitting at the back. And we're going to get this off and get it out of the way. All right, that's the bolt that holds the housing on. These These housings are just a little bit snug on here, and I would imagine as long as it's been on here, it would be fairly snug. But the main thing is you don't want to bend this housing. We don't want to do any damage to it, so we want to get it off as carefully as we can. All right. There exposes our power steering pump and a reservoir housing, and inside the housing it looks like at some point in time we had some water because there's some rust inside the housing, and I'm going to clean this up real good before I put it back on. But right now we'll get to the O-ring seal, is what I suspect that our problem is, as well as our filter, and it just pulls right off. There is no O-ring on either side, it's just a filter, and it just sits on the back of the pump and filters the fluid as it goes back through the pump. And that's our filter. And we want to make sure that we keep everything clean and keep it to where that if we've got to make sure that we've got the right filter and parts. And the only way to do that, we know that filter is still good, and as long as we don't contaminate it, we can use it back if we have to. All right, right now we're going to get our O-ring off. Take a small screwdriver and go around and pull this off. And that's our O-ring. And the O-ring feels pretty hard. I don't see any cuts in it, but it could be that the reservoir housing or a little bit of rust could have been the issue, because we've got a little bit of rust around the area where the O-ring seals. And we'll have to clean that up before we put it together. All right, I have cleaned up my pump reservoir. I took the spring and the washer, and it has a little retaining clip that holds this in place. All it does is hold it in place to where when you put it up and it captures the filter, which we have the new filter, and I've checked it against the other one, and it looks identical to it. So we'll hang it on the back of the reservoir where it goes. And then I'm going to put my spring and washer and retaining clip, but I took it up to the parts washer at the shop and I cleaned it, and I used a Scotch-Brite pad to clean it with. I could have probably used a bead blaster, but I wanted to make sure I didn't get any sand in this that I didn't find and clean up, and I thought it did a pretty good job, and I sanded it real good where the O-ring seals, and that might have been some of my problem because it looked like it had some moisture built up around the O-ring and had started to rust. So we're going to go ahead and get our O-ring on and get our spring and washer and retainer in, and then we will put this reservoir back on. All right, at this time I've got power steering fluid around my O-ring. I've got it good and wet. I've also got power steering fluid around the inside of my housing to make sure whenever it slides up on the O-ring, it doesn't cut the O-ring. Getting ready to put the O-ring on now, and I'm going to try to locate it in the back groove. We've cleaned it extremely good, and I'm going to try to locate it in the back groove and pull it to the front and see if I can get it into place fairly easy. When I do this, I like to pull on both sides so that when the O-ring goes on, it doesn't roll on, that it goes on nice and straight. Then that way it doesn't have a twist in it, and it seals better when I do that. All right, the O-ring's on. We clean the housing real well. I also put my wire back on my indicator light for the oil pressure. I went ahead and did that while I could get to it. Now I'll put the filter on. It doesn't matter. This looks like it can go either way. And there's no O-rings on the inside. It just seals against this flange on the filter. Okay. Now on the reservoir, I put my spring, my washer, and my retaining clip in. That washer just holds that filter up tight against the pump itself. So now we'll slide this reservoir into place. And it's not going to let me do it until I take the wire back off for the oil pressure. I'll have to hook that up at a later time. Put the filter back up. Make sure our wire is not contacting anything. And I'm going to hold right there until I put this is a new washer that came in the kit. It's got a rubber O-ring on each side of the washer that seals this. And I just want to slide that on the bolt, put that into the reservoir housing, and find my threads on the inside and snug this up. And I don't want to tighten it until I get my orientation correct where my line goes, because this fitting on the back of the reservoir does not move. So we've got to make sure that it's in line with our lines, that it works well, fits well whenever we get it ready to put back on. All right, I got my lines put in place, and what I did was I started the ones at the sector first. And what you want to do is make sure that these nuts turn easy to where that you can start them by hand to know that you're not cross-threaded. It's very important that you get these started back and not cross-thread these things, because you could have major problems if you do. I've started the lines here at the top at the sector, and now I'm putting this is our bolt for our bracket that goes into the transmission case. All I'm going to do is start it right now. We'll start the line, the pressure line at the bottom of the pump to make sure that we're not cross-threaded there. And then until we slide this housing on into place, it looks like my orientation, the lineup of the fitting on the back of the reservoir along with the line, it looks like it's lined up, and we're going to ease it into place using our socket. We'll just pull it on into place, and you see our gap closing up right there. And I'm not going to tighten it all the way up until I make sure that we have our line started here on our fitting. And that has started extremely good, and all we got to do now is tighten the lines up, and then we will go to the next step. All right, I had my lines started on the pump reservoir and on the pump itself, and I had to take them loose because I had a little bit of problem in getting my lines to line up correctly and start on the steering sector up here. So I went ahead and took these back off, and then I took these back off, took these off, and started and did these first, got them started, and then got the pump reservoir lined up correctly with the fitting. Everything started with the lines now, and all I got to do is bolt my bracket back up at the transmission housing. I'll tighten my lines up, and then we'll connect our light for our oil pressure. We want to make sure we do that so that we don't have a problem with oil pressure and we don't know about it. And that will click firmly into place. And now all we have to do is put fluid in the reservoir, power steering fluid, and then spin our oil filter back on. And right now we're going to tighten our reservoir, because that was the one thing that we didn't do until we got our alignment with the lines that come from the sector. And I'll snug that down because we replaced the O-ring, the filter, and the little washer that goes on the bolt at the back of the reservoir that has the rubber sealer around it. So now all we have to do is oil filter back on, put fluid in our reservoir, make sure our lines are tight, and tighten our bracket, and we should be close to done. All right, we've got our oil filter back on. It's tight. We've cleaned all the oil away. You'll have a little bit of oil that'll drip when you do this. Also a little bit too from the lines and from the reservoir. We filled the reservoir up. We've checked our lines. We've checked our bracket here in the middle. We've checked our lines here at the sector. All we have to do now is put our cover back on. There's a little grommet that fits in the bottom of this cover that we'll put back in once we put it back on. And then we'll put our 4 retaining screws that are Phillips head back in. We'll crank this thing. You want to check after you crank it, we'll check the oil again to make sure that we didn't lose very much oil. I know we didn't in this one, but we want to check and make sure. Notice too that I write the hours and the date. This tractor's got just under 900 hours, and I like to change the oil in it before wintertime, because it's not good for these things to sit on used oil in the wintertime. So I like to change the oil just before I put the tractor up in the wintertime. But we've got everything tight. Our bolt holding the reservoir cover is tight. Our cap's on tight. We're ready to put our cover on, start it up, and then check our fluid levels, and hopefully we won't have any more leaks. All right, I've put our oil filter back on, filled up the reservoir, checked the oil, cranked it up, let it run, checked my lines again, checked my filter, make sure it was tight. I checked the fluid level in the reservoir, and it is full. And it looks like we may have solved our leaking issue for about $10. Filter kit with an O-ring, and hopefully we've got everything situated. And check the oil light. The oil light is working. The little screws on this cover, make sure you put them on snug, and when you do, it's good to use a little bit of lubricant on those threads so that they go in nice and easy, and make sure they're good and tight, because they could vibrate out if you don't. Lines are tight, brackets tight, filters on, reservoirs on, tight. The nuts are tight on our lines. And like I say, make sure that whenever you do any of these lines, it would be advisable to use a line wrench on these, and just make sure that you use the correct size. No matter what it is, just make sure it fits extremely tight whenever you do, and you won't damage the lines. And everything should work good. And we're now ready to go to work.